Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive one. We're going to explore one of the most profound historical and philosophical paradoxes in human history together. For centuries, literally hundreds of years, brilliant minds have grappled with this ultimate question. How exactly do we define the complex nature of Jesus Christ? Think about it. How do you even begin to put into words a figure believed by billions to be simultaneously finite and infinite? It's a lot to wrap your head around. So let's trace this fascinating historical journey of ancient creeds, fierce debates, and modern mirrors. All right, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the ultimate identity crisis, look at the Council of Chalcedon, and then decode the 5 pillars of orthodoxy. After that, we'll explore defending the definition, the modern historical shift, and finally, the mirror of history. Let's get into it. Section 1. The ultimate identity crisis and the danger of the third something. Okay, to really grasp the stakes here, we've got to transport ourselves all the way back to the 5th century. The early church had hit this massive historical and theological roadblock regarding Christ's identity. And getting this wrong? Well, it threatened what they believed to be the very foundation of salvation. Right at the center of this crisis was a presbyter named Eutychius. He championed a teaching called Monophysitism, which basically means one nature. He taught that in the incarnation, Christ's humanity was completely absorbed into his divinity. To picture this, imagine a single drop of vinegar falling into the vast ocean. Eutychius believed the result was a tertium quid, a third something, that was overwhelmingly divine, and frankly, barely human at all. Now, you can probably see why the logical failure of the Monophysite view completely terrified the early church. If Christ is just this blended, mostly divine hybrid, then logically he's neither truly God nor truly man. The Orthodox view held firmly that a savior who wasn't fully human couldn't actually redeem humanity. It just wouldn't work. They realized they desperately needed a framework that preserved both distinct natures without blending them into some sort of muddy hybrid. Moving right along to Section 2, the Council of Chalcedon, building the guardrails. Picture this. It's October of 451 AD, and a staggering 520 bishops gather in Chalcedon. The sheer scale of a gathering like this in the ancient world is absolutely incredible. Heavily influenced by a crucial document called Pope Leo's Tome, this massive assembly set out to curb the really dangerous theological speculations of their day and hopefully find a vocabulary that could finally unite the East and the West. Out of this monumental gathering came what we now call the Chalcedonian definition. And the absolute genius of this definition is found in these 4 very precise withouts. They declared that Christ existed in 2 natures, without confusion, without change, without division, and without separation. The first 2 withouts basically formed a defensive perimeter against the Monophysites who wanted to blend the natures together. And the second 2, they guarded against anyone who wanted to split Christ into 2 entirely separate people. Section 3, 5 pillars of orthodoxy, decoding the definition. So Chalcedon made this brilliant, incredibly crucial distinction between the person, or the hypostasis, and the nature, the ousia. As you can see, there is only one active subject, the eternal Son. But this single acting agent subsists seamlessly in 2 distinct natures. There's no new person being created here, and absolutely no blending of the natures. It's the singular person of the Son acting in and through both his humanity and his divinity. This quote brilliantly illustrates the real-world impact of that theology. It gives us what's known as the transfer of attributes. Essentially, it means that the singular person of the Son can simultaneously uphold the entire universe as God, and yet sit down at a well, genuinely tired and thirsty as a human being. It's the one person experiencing both fully. Mind-bending, right? Section 4, defending the definition, addressing the critics. Now, as magnificent an achievement as Chalcedon was for Orthodox believers, modern Enlightenment thinkers have aimed some intense criticisms at these ancient guardrails. Let's take a look at the 3 major attacks leveled against the ancient creed. First, critics argue it's far too dependent on archaic Greek philosophy. Second, they argue it's too dualistic, sort of clumsily placing 2 unmixable natures side by side. And finally, they argue it's implicitly docetic, which is just a fancy way of saying it makes Jesus' actual humanity seem impersonal or unreal. But theologians have fiercely defended the creed against these claims. Let's take that too Greek criticism, for example. As theologian Donald MacLeod points out, God himself enters upon an earthly historical existence. That is a profoundly un-Greek concept.
You see, Greek myths absolutely loved the idea of a god putting on a human disguise, like a theophany. But a god who genuinely takes on human flesh, suffers actual poverty, and tastes real death, that totally violated Greek philosophical norms. No way they would have come up with that.
And to counter the charge of being too dualistic, defenders of Chalcedon point to this simple yet incredibly powerful phrase: to explain the mystery is to transgress. Actually, Chalcedon never even tried to mathematically solve the paradox of the incarnation. That wasn't the goal. It simply laid out the biblical data, set up those guardrails to keep out logical errors, and then bowed in respect to a profound mystery that human language just can't fully capture.
Section 5. The modern historical shift. Abandoning the guardrails.
So, what happens when scholars decide they don't want mystery anymore? Well, we jump from Chalcedon in 451 all the way to the 18th century, where thinkers like Descartes and Kant highly depreciated history compared to hard science. But then, in the 19th century, history makes this massive comeback. Scholars suddenly believed they could apply rigid, objective, scientific techniques to historical events. And inevitably, this intense new obsession crossed right over into biblical theology.
This cross-pollination birthed what became known as the Lives of Jesus movement. This was a massive 19th century academic trend where scholars tried to reconstruct a purely historical Jesus. To pull this off, they deliberately stripped away the Chalcedonian creeds, the miracles, the doctrines, the whole shebang. They wanted to find a rational, modern Jesus that would be perfectly palatable to enlightened scientific thinkers. They completely abandoned the ancient guardrails in search of raw data.
And finally, Section 6, the Mirror of History. Schweitzer's devastating critique. Well, the attempt to find a purely scientific Jesus eventually met its match in a brilliant polymath named Albert Schweitzer. He meticulously reviewed all these 19th century Lives of Jesus books and realized something incredibly damning. These liberal scholars hadn't discovered the real historical Jesus at all. Nope, they had just designed a figure entirely out of their own rationalism. As Schweitzer devastatingly noted, they must have been looking down the long well of human history and seen their own faces reflected at the bottom. Ouch. They had simply dressed Jesus up in their own modern clothes. It's an incredible realization, isn't it? The ancient church built these careful guardrails to protect a profound, unexplainable mystery. Meanwhile, modern scholars tried to completely rationalize that mystery away, and really only ended up finding themselves. So I want to leave you with this to ponder. When we try to rationalize history's greatest mysteries, do we actually reveal the truth about the past? Or are we just seeing the reflection of our own present? Thanks for exploring this with me today.